this meeting of the Alexander County Board of Commissioners into session. Tonight, Chairman Yoder, that's me, will be having the invocation and will be followed by the Pledge of Allegiance by Commissioner Andrew Ferguson. Everybody will please stand. Our kind and most gracious Heavenly Father, we appreciate the opportunity that we have that we can gather in a place of freedom, in a place where things can be discussed in an open session and in adult manners. Lord, we'd ask you to be with our military personnel, both at home and abroad. Be with our leaders, both on the national, state, and local level. Be with those families in South Korea, Lord, as they go through a devastating event that has happened in their lives. Be with them that there's some way, somehow, that peace could come about these people in the loss of their loved ones. Be with those who have lost loved ones in the plane crash. Hope that we can find it and bring peace to these people and bring closure to their families. We'd ask that you be with us now and help lead and guide us. For we ask all these things in thy name. Amen.
Amen. Flag, salute, pledge. I
Pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. You may be seated. Under the Commissioner's report, I have a couple of things I need to bring to the attention of the folks in the county. Number one, it came to my attention that there's an outage of a substation in the Stony Point area. Those folks living on the Alexander-Iredell County line will be experiencing outages for the next little while. Duke Power has notified us and told us that they should have crews on the scene within the hour and should have this thing corrected just as soon as possible. So if you're experiencing outages, this is what's going on, and we just really want those folks in the Stony Point area to know that Duke Power is on their way. They're coming to turn your lights back on and maybe make the evening a little bit more pleasant for you. Also, this Thursday night, April the 24th at 7 p.m. here at CVCC, Catawba Valley Community College here in Titusville, there'll be a Meet the Candidates public forum to hear the candidates speak out, and all the candidates running for office in the 2014 primary and general election have been invited to participate in this opportunity to the citizens. And again, this will be this Thursday night, April the 24th at 7 p.m. And another event is occurring on Tuesday, April the 29th, which is fantastic for the Alexander County community. Joseph Bathonti, who is the Poet Laureate of North Carolina, will be at the Bethlehem branch of the Alexander County Library. He will be there on the Tuesday, April the 29th at 7 p.m. And if some of you do not know, he is the Poet Laureate of North Carolina. He was born and raised in Pittsburgh, North Carolina. He has a BA and an MA, master's degrees in English literature from the University of Pittsburgh, as well as an MFA in creative writing from Warren Wilson College. He's a professor of creative writing at Appalachian State University in Boone, where he is also the writer in residence for the university's Watauga Global Community and director of writing in the field. He's the author of 8 books of poetry, including the medal nominated for the National Book Award. His most recent book, Concertina, was published in the fall of 2013 by Mercer University Press. This is a tremendous privilege for the people of Alexander County to be able to hear this gentleman, and to have a Poet Laureate come to Alexander County speaks highly of our library and the friends of the library who have taken this opportunity to invite him here. And once again, this will be Tuesday night, April the 29th, 7 p.m. at the Bethlehem Library. And I felt like that was some things of interest that the citizens of this county needed to know about. Does any other commissioner have anything that they'd like to say at this time?
Larry, we also have a former resident, Orner Tucow, who had a film premiered at Tribeca.
Right.
And was in the top 10 list of movies to see at Tribeca by the Wall Street Journal. So that was a good feather in the cap.
Absolutely. Read about that today. That's very good. Any other commissioners?
No.
If not, you have your agenda before you, and I make a motion that we approve the agenda as is.
Second.
Motion's been made and seconded. Is there any discussion? There being none, all those in favor indicate by raising your right hand. Those opposed likewise, the motion carries. And at this time, I'd like to call on Anthony Starr of the Assistant Executive Director with Western Piedmont Council of Governments, who has conducted an EMS study for us, and he's going to give us those results of that study. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Appreciate the opportunity to appear before you today and give you a little bit of an overview of the information that we've gathered and analyzed. A few months ago, the county manager contacted me about the idea of doing an analysis of the county's EMS response times to determine if additional units were necessary and where they might be placed so that decisions could be made with the most amount of information available to you going forward. So that's what we did. I'd like to also introduce Scott Miller here today. He's our GIS and Information Technology Director for the Council of Governments, and he and his staff did a majority of the work here with this study. And they did an excellent job, I believe, with it. We're really pleased with the analysis and how it turned out and the insight that's been gained out of it. In fact, so much we'll probably nominate it for a few awards as we go forward. We feel pretty good about it. And we hope that you'll feel good about the information that it gives you. It may not be exactly in terms of what things that were intuitive that you thought might be in the information, but I think you'll find that it's insightful. And we'll be glad to answer questions as we go along through here. Just a little bit about Scott and myself. Scott, has worked for the Council of Governments since the mid-90s. He actually managed the project that it created Alexander County's GIS system back then, if you recall, for those of you who were around then. And he's been with us for a number of years. He also worked for the state, very accomplished analyst and manager of GIS projects. Myself, I've been in local government for going on 20 years as a town manager, a county planning director, a variety of other roles. I spent 8 years actually in emergency services, much of it volunteer when I was younger, and grew up just across the river in Catfish. Went to Bunker Hill High School, so it's always good to come up here and talk about things. So when we looked at this study, we tried to determine okay, how do we know what response time is good and what is not? And what we arrived at was 8 minutes is the standard in which you strive for. And it's highlighted in some different areas, and it seems to be the pretty common measuring stick, if you will, about EMS response times. National Fire Protection Association 1710 is a publication they put out about EMS operations, and it cites the 8-minute standard as well. And your emergency services director and I, talked about this. Our GIS staff talked about this at length before we even got started to make sure we were using the right standard. And we're confident that the 8-minute standard is what we ought to go ahead and use. So first thing we did was we looked at and pulled all the data that we could. And we pulled all the EMS calls data for Alexander County from February 2008 to January 2014, which was all the data that we had available when we started. And you'll see here in this graph on the screen the top bar is the state response times and averages. It's broken down into 4 categories. There's the en route, which is blue, the at the scene time, how much the time they spend on the scene, in red, and transport time taking it to a medical facility, is there in green, and then purple would be back in service when they're cleaning the truck or traveling back to their jurisdiction, in your case especially. So you see there that your response time actually is a little bit lower than the state average. So you're doing really well with the current 2 bases you have and 3 EMS crews in those 2 bases. You're at the scene response time, you're right on average with the state there. And not surprisingly, your transport time and your back and service times are considerably longer than the state average. And you can't really do much about those because you don't have a medical facility in Alexander County. And we would attribute that as the main reason, the travel time that you have to go to transport your patients, whether it be to Iredell County or Caldwell County or Fry or Catawba Valley Medical Center, any one of those facilities, and the travel time back. So when we looked at this, and looked at all the data, we realized that 21% of your calls took longer than 8 minutes to respond to the scene. That's the part of the equation that you can control, is your response time to the scene. And so when we looked at that, we looked at all of those data, all those calls. There were 26,401 calls that we looked at. And as I mentioned, 79% fell within 8 minutes. That's pretty good. That's not bad. We also determined that 5,654 over those 5 years plus were longer than 8 minutes. The average time that it takes for your county from the time the call begins to when they check back in service and are available to respond to another call is 73 minutes, so almost an hour and 15 minutes. Average response time being 7.2 minutes, as I mentioned before. So we wanted to look at, well, are there areas in the data that point to maybe certain times a day, certain times a week that are problems that we could staff a crew maybe on a certain day or a certain shift of hours of the day to, or certain days of the week that would benefit the response time the most. And what we looked at first was the day of the week. So you see here the little line going across the middle of the screen there. That is the average time or average number of calls per day. The days are down here at the bottom. And then the top and bottom of those lines represent the minimum and maximum calls for any particular day. So I didn't really show you anything new there in that. It didn't show us anything there, so there's nothing that stood out. There's no one day worse than the other, really, not substantially. So then we also looked at, well, is there a certain time of day during a particular day, during the days of the week that you have a peak? And we looked at, we looked at all of them, and basically we found we did not have an issue with a particular hour being a peak more than the others. And we threw a couple of graphs as examples up here. One's Thursdays. All the Thursdays, you see a peak there at 1800 hours, 6 p.m. Right there. But then that doesn't show up on other days. It doesn't show up on Fridays. On Fridays, it looks like the peak time is 11 a.m., between 9 and 11 a.m., but that doesn't show up on other days either. So there's nothing conclusive there that you could take away and say, we'll put a crew on in service for, half a day or 6 hours out of the day to address peak call times. The data doesn't support that would be, I'm sure it would improve things, but it wouldn't be terribly effective in the grand scheme of things probably. And so when we looked at that, we looked at all those data. There's a few data sources there that we list. I won't mention every one of them, but we did look at all the call data for the last 6 years, used your GIS information, traffic counts, and census information. So we looked at your current conditions, and this is a map of the county, and it shows the current 2 EMS station locations. You have, of course, 2 EMS crews at this location and 1 EMS crew in Bethlehem. So it also shows your fire department locations and all of your school locations with these little flags. And what the colors mean here is what we mapped, how far could that EMS crew reach in 8 minutes? Using basically the computer with the system we used is it mapped and basically artificially drove the crew following the speed limit to how far could it get in 8 minutes. And so everywhere within the red boundaries here, and the green is like 1 minute, and it goes on out to the red, which is 8 minutes, inside of 8 minutes. And then the gray area is anywhere beyond 8 minutes. Now, that's not to suggest that those folks are getting, poor service. It just means that it takes longer than 8 minutes. Because frankly, it would not be cost feasible to have your entire county within an 8-minute response zone. It's just, your population, like 99% of counties, is spread out in various areas, and you'll never have that kind of coverage unless you're a really urban, densely populated county, perhaps like Wake or Mecklenburg. And I don't even think they have their entire counties within 8 minutes. So we looked at, as part of analysis, we looked at, okay, where are the population concentrations? And the darker colors here show where there are larger numbers of people. These are census tracts So you can see here near Taylorsville, and then down in Bethlehem, as you might expect, and south of Taylorsville here as well. We also looked at, well, what population characteristics should we look at in terms of where the need is in the county? Elderly population, of course, needing more EMS response calls than a typical citizen. Back up one, if you would, please, Chad. And so you can tell here that there's, Taylorsville has a large concentration of elderly folks, as does Bethlehem as well. And then there's a tract over here towards Stony Point as well that has some concentration. Go ahead to the next. So what we did then, we took that information, we took all the calls, and we tried to identify where are the trouble areas, if you want to call them that, the hot spots. And this is what we call a heat map. And what it shows you is the concentrations of calls that took longer than 8 minutes over the last 6 years. So the blue lines show you how far that EMS crew could get, assuming it's available, by driving what would be the expected speed. And so, you know, you see a couple of things that come out of this map that are really insightful. One is that several of the areas that you have concentrations of calls that took longer than 8 minutes are inside an area that they should normally be able to get there within 8 minutes. And then, of course, there's an area here in Wittenberg that shows that you have a concentration of calls 8 minutes or longer there, and that's because you have some good population numbers there, and those crews are not going to get there within 8 minutes, even if they're sitting at the base and ready to respond when the call comes in. It's just too far to get there. So what this shows you out of this map really here, particularly with these clusters and Stony Point as well, is that you have a problem with the crews not being available with that particular response zone. And because those calls in there, that suggests that their call volume supports the need for an additional crew. Those clusters of longer than 8 minutes are not going to be alleviated if they're inside the blue line simply by moving an EMS crew for the most part. They're because both those crews right here at this station were tied up on other calls. They were either with the patient or they were traveling to a hospital or back from a hospital or weren't in service somehow. So Highway 16 South was the other where you had several of the concentrations as well, in addition to downtown Taylorsville area. So when we ran the numbers, it looks like just over half, or 52% of your calls with greater than 8 minute response time were within the primary response zones that it normally would take less than 8 minutes to get to. Almost the other half, 48% of the calls, were outside of those 8 minute response zones. In other words, without positioning a crew in a different location, you're not going to impact that 48%. So this does show that the data supports an additional EMS and EMS station is justified. Now, let me say one thing here. This is just a presentation to show about what the data points to. It does not, I'm not here to try to twist your arm into creating another EMS unit or building a station. What I'm here is just to give you some information, because you have to weigh this information with all the other needs that you have with the county and your budget demands. And I know I've had these conversations with Mr. French. You know, like so many other counties, you have way more demands on services than you have financial resources provided. So it'll be a policy decision for you to decide when and if you address these issues that are raised up that have been confirmed by some of the data here. So that in mind, we looked at several locations of where, if you were going to place a new EMS station, where would it improve, what location would improve the response times the most? So the first one that was probably the prevailing wisdom of where the next EMS station would be located before we did the study was on Highway 16 north of Taylorsville. And we looked at that and we determined, you see down here in the box in the bottom of the slide there, there's a few stats for you. It's the same as that previous map, is that if it's in green, yellow, or red, you can get there within 8 minutes. If it's in the gray area, you're not going to get there within 8 minutes. You'll notice, of course, this area, it won't address the Wittenberg area concentration of calls over 8 minutes. But it does capture 78% of the population within those 8-minute response zones, and 83% of all your calls would fall within those potential areas, 62% of the land area. So we looked at another location, and there was some other mapping that we did behind the scenes that basically helped us point out where the potential locations would be, and then we ran the numbers to make sure and look at this. And so probably one of the main best locations would be, if you were going to site a new EMS base, would be at Church Road. Back up one, please. At Church Road and Loudon Road. You can see right here, this would be the location. And it captures 83% of the population. 90% of all your calls would fall within one of those 3 response zones, and 58% of your land area. Go ahead and go to the next. So we also looked at the southwest part of the county going on, and a similar location would be at Church and Teaguetown Road. Trying to see if that would, tweak it and see if it would make it any better. It does capture Wittenberg area, as does the last at Lyledown Station would. 81% of the population would be within those 3 response zones, as well as 89% of all calls. 54% of your land area, though. Next, please. And so then the other location that we looked at in addition, we looked at probably 8 to 10 different areas, locations, but I wanted to show you just the ones that probably rank the highest here. 82% of the population, this is at Highway 16 and Macedonia Church Road. And so it would capture 82% of the population, 90% of all the calls, and 55% of the land area. Of course, this station would help you a lot with the calls in Taylorsville, inside the town, as well as the concentration of calls you had down here in Wittenberg area. So when we just ran the statistics here and showed you, technically speaking, a new station at Church and Loudon provides the best solution, but frankly, the statistics between 2 other locations were so close that really all 3 of those locations would be viable locations, good locations, to site a 3rd EMS base with a fourth crew. You can see here that what these bar charts show you is the current conditions here, with 21% of your calls taking longer than 8 minutes outside of your 8-minute response zone. The Highway 16 North Station would have improved some of that, but not as much as these other 3 locations, where the Church and Lyledown had the best, with 10% there, 2,563 calls over a 6-year period would have still been outside 8-minute response zone, reminding you that you're never going to get to 100%, practically speaking. It wouldn't be financially feasible. You'd have to have so many crews in so many different locations to get there. Then Church and Teague, and then Highway 16 South at Macedonia Church Road. So those 2 are statistically the closest, but you'll notice here there's only like 60 calls difference over a 6 years period between that one, and then only 100, not even 100. Well, I guess it's about 200 there, 240 difference there over a 6-year period. That's not really many. That's not really statistically significant difference there. So many of the calls with the response times greater than 8 minutes are due to the primary. Here's the conclusions that we took away. Many of the calls that you had that took longer than 8 minutes were not because they were out beyond the distance you could get to in 8 minutes. A slight majority of those were because the primary crew was already tied up on another call. So the data does show the need to locate a new station to improve response times, or add a 4th EMS crew to an existing station. That would, if you added a 4th EMS crew to the existing station, it would improve your response times. It would not improve them as much as if you sited a new station, though. So it may be that you decided at some point to do that in phases. You may decide to first bring on and hire a 4th EMS crew, maybe even for half of a day every day, for example, as a starting point to make improvement. And then once you did it in phases and you got to a certain point, you build the station where you determined it was best to build one. So this study gives you a few locations, 3 primary locations you consider. I would say all of those would be very solid options to site a new EMS station if you went that route to build one. There was minor differences in which one would be better than the other, but in the end, it wasn't a significant difference. And frankly, having 3 good options there, if you were to have to purchase land to build a new EMS station, that'll put you in a better bargaining position when you go to do that, because you can say, well, we can site it over here, and just determine which one you can get the most cost-effective purchase of land and building a new station if and when you arrive at that point sometime down the road. So with that, I'll be glad to answer any questions the board may have, or Scott would, or Bradley.
Anybody have any questions?
Anthony, thank you for doing this report. And being familiar with the ArcGIS stuff, there's some input issues that sometimes when you put it onto the report and you try to go on the ground level and you look around the ground level and you realize, well, okay, maybe something's going on. I got a couple questions about some of your input data. For
And I may
instance,
call Scott up here for some of this, because he's more familiar with the
For
details.
instance, your slide 9, Chad, slide 9 and 10, which is the current conditions, census block from the 2010 census.
Yeah.
What kind of I mean, when you were doing your report, you were using the data up to 2010. Was there any attempt to use the projected data, the projected census data? Because we have some population movement and we're looking at it. Bottom line is, we're trying to figure out how to fix a potential problem right now, but we're talking about a solution that we're gonna have to live with
Sure.
20 years down the road, and if the population shifts, will we come back 20 years from now and saying, gosh, I wish we hadn't done that, I wish we had done it here?
Sure. And that's a good question. And we did look at where the growth was going to occur. Of course, we do the transportation planning for the region, so we had conversations with our other staff about that. And as you might expect, probably has been projected in multiple things that's looked at, transportation funding and planning down the road. The southern part of the county is what's projected to consistently be the area where you'll see the most amount of growth. And we just did that within the last year. I think Taylor Dellinger did. I'm trying to remember, was it it's one of the transportation plans that we have to do, and I don't remember which one it was, but they did look at that, and we had that conversation. Scott, do you have anything you want to add to that? It did show the growth would be in, and the reason why we didn't create a second map is because it pretty much identified with where most of the current densities were anyway. It kind of overlapped, but we'd be glad to generate a second map in that area and provide that for you. It would be very, very little time involved to create a map that shows from some of the current reports we've done in terms of population projections. And I'm thinking specifically, Scott, about the transportation analysis zones mapping that John Marshall's group had done, where they divided up our region into 4,000 little blocks, and each one has its own set of numbers that's assigned and predicted for in terms of population, employment, and traffic. Right. And that's used to do the transportation analysis for the region. So we can look at that and see what we have to provide with you. That would be insightful for you. Good. But when we talked about it, it seemed like it wasn't going to lead us in a different direction than what the data showed here with this.
And the second part, which is another data issue, is you were doing the call volume and you did the 26,400 calls. Was there any differentiation between transportation calls and non-transport calls, emergency calls, and what we'd call routine calls in emergency services?
You want to come answer that one, Scott? Because I know Scott and I had some conversations, but I think he's in a position to better answer than I am.
Yeah, as we went through and looked at the data, we pulled those out. So I guess our number here says 26,401. That's what we looked at total, and then we pull those out and not use the ones that were just transport.
So this is all just based on transport calls, emergency transport calls?
Yes.
Okay.
And there weren't that many, in comparison to this body either, as we went through. I mean, there were enough, but it's not like there were hundreds and thousands of them. It was
right.
limited number.
That'd be like the convalescence calls, what we're talking about.
All right, and the slide 11, Chad, if you would, 1-1. Number 11, which is the hotspots.
Keep going.
Couple
It's
more.
the one with the,
There
yeah,
you
there
go.
we go.
All right, so the hotspot there on 16 South, the very first hotspot, once you get past 64,
Right
that's
there.
the prison.
Yes.
Okay, so the
That
reason
is
why
the
there's a,
area around
yeah,
the prison.
yeah.
We didn't pinpoint all those calls on the prison, but I'm sure it was a large factor.
Oh, sure. The problem with the 8-minute call volume, or the 8-minute ticker right there, is the security procedures. Even if they get there within the 8 minutes, which obviously you guys can get there within the 8 minutes, but they're still gonna have to sit out there, so that's gonna kind of skew the data a little bit.
Do you guys check? Yeah,
And then, yeah, it's up to the, yes.
so that wouldn't be a factor.
Excuse me just a minute. Brad, if you don't mind, if you come up and speak so everybody can hear you, because if you try to hear you out there, all they're gonna hear on the radio is blah, blah. So if you come up, please, thank you. I just want everybody to be able to hear.
Good question.
Thank you very much.
That's an excellent question.
No, they check on the scene at the gate, let them know they're at the gate,
Right.
awaiting, so that's the on-scene time that we use.
All right, so
Then
that's,
you can have an at-patient time that we can add into the chart, but we don't change that on-scene time. It basically, the time starts when you get there at the gate, your on-scene time runs until you leave the gate.
So the takeaway is that it would not have unnecessarily created a call volume because of security issues.
right, okay.
They were there. Now, because the volume of calls, it's probably why it's there.
Right.
And the fact that they were either tied up on another unit or out of position.
Well, Highway 16 South's a high accident ratio anyway, especially getting down there at the dam, right there at Millersville. Those areas are, and right there at the intersection of,
Population too.
I call it High Water Bridge Road. That's what I always knew it by, right there at, where Approach Super 8 used to be. It's a different name now. But, those are some of our higher volume calls, you know, but, one of the questions I really want, and the other one I'd want to ask about is time back in service. It went up from 24.2 to 31. That's a 7-minute increase. I'm a little surprised at that.
That's one of the first slides, Chad. There you go, that's it. So that's probably the time, that extra time it takes for them to travel back from the medical facility to the county to be in position. So it includes both, and correct me if I'm wrong, both the time it takes to clean the truck, restock it, as well as travel back to district and be in position to respond to calls again.
Right.
So,
The hospital overcrowding is also added to that problem as well, because most of the hospitals are full when we get there now. And they look for a place to put the patient. And that slows us down several minutes.
so, a good part of that will be because you guys don't have a medical facility to transport to inside Alexander County, and so there's not much you can do to reduce that at this point.
Okay, you bring that up, and then you look at the response time in other counties compared across the state. What's the average response time from, for EMS units to respond, well, not to respond, but transport time? They got 16.5 minutes. Is that, what's, counties of our size that doesn't have a hospital? Was there any comparison that was done to that to see what the time element was there? Of course, I don't worry too much about the time element because I know about our paramedics and I know how well trained they are. So I don't really worry that much about the transport time because they're in constant communication with a doctor that a lot of folks don't understand, and they can do just about 99% of everything they can do in the emergency room until they get a doctor there to actually have to perform more emergency procedures. But based on counties that are 20 miles away from emergency facilities or more, how does that?
I don't think the data was available for us to do
Okay.
that analysis, and you guys might be able to elaborate it, or at least it wasn't readily, we'd have to create the data and do some sort of survey and try to determine which counties that fell into that status and which did not.
I was going to ask, I had a couple points to make whenever.
Okay, that's fine. No. Okay.
I wish we had that level of information, but we don't. And you're right, I think, the fact that your transport time is longer is not that that person's care is being compromised because they're transporting that longer. They're under good care now. I mean, the level of care that's afforded people by EMS crews this day is far above than what they got in the emergency room 20 years ago.
Right.
So where it's a problem for you is that the longer they have to spend transporting that patient to that other county means that's longer, they're not available for the next call that's coming in. That's where it's a problem in terms of EMS care for you, is that it delays their availability to respond to the next call.
Right. Thank you.
Good point.
Does anybody else have any questions?
Mr. Chairman?
Yes, sir, Mr. French.
Just a couple items that we talked about. One is that in the study where it addressed locations or potential locations for a station, you could also just station a unit there. You know, an EMS unit could be stationed there. We've done that in the past where we've moved it to a certain location because of to be closer to where some of the calls may be. And secondly, there's a large number of fire departments in our county. There might be a relationship there we want to explore and talk about, because some of those volunteer fire departments are in those same areas. And also, we don't want to forget our rescue squad that we work well with. They could also play into this equation too. So there's a lot of good information here to look at and digest, but I think there's a couple other points like we've just talked about to consider, because you're talking about a very important service. Time is critical, but also you're talking about a lot of fun, a lot of money. So a lot of things to consider.
And at the same thing, I think the folks in the county need to understand that our EMS, and when I say EMS, I'm talking about our emergency services, have already been moving a unit into an area to be able to respond quicker.
Right.
And we've also, I think it's been 6 years ago, we added quick response vehicles so that we'd be able to get somebody on the scene quicker. So basically, when you talk about our EMS, there's 2 response units that are at Bethlehem, 3 response units that are at our Titusville base. 2 of them do not transport. They're just the QRV vehicles. So that works out real good for us. But some of the things that, that you talk about that we already have implemented and are taking place at this time to take care of things. I think it's interesting that, and I'm sure it came as a surprise to several people that Church Road and Lyle Dam would be a place to put an EMS unit. I think that would surprise a tremendous amount of people. There's a lot of traffic on Church Road, a lot of traffic on Tigtown Road, and a lot of people use High Water Bridge Road from here to Bethlehem. So
Right.
it makes a lot of sense. I think you guys did a real good job, and I think it brought to light a lot of questions that we had, along with our EMS units and personnel rather. And I think it tells us some things that we needed to know, and probably thought maybe it was going to go another way, but these numbers show where it is. And you guys did a tremendous job, and I want to tell you thank you very much. And this is good information that we'll need to use.
Thank you, and I just wanted to note too that your staff was excellent to work with during this project. They were very, very capable, very knowledgeable, and very prompt in helping us get the data and talk through some of the scenarios and discussions that we had met on several occasions to make sure we were really hammering out the details and not missing anything, and they were very insightful and very helpful with that.
Very good.
Since Bradley's here, I know I got a question for Bradley, if you don't mind.
That's fine.
Bradley, I got a question for you, and this is an information just for us and for what is the difference between an ALS crew and a BLS crew, just for information's sake?
Basic life support crew basically has EMTs that take care of the person. They do just general care, splint, spinal mobilization, put on oxygen, and then they can transport to the hospital. An advanced life support crew like we have, it's staffed at paramedic level. We have, I think, 42 medications on the truck. We carry chilled IV fluids, all kinds of medications, and we do all kinds of procedures that I never dreamed when I started EMS that we could do in the field now. And we're adding some new ones as we speak. We're working on adding a new thing to help with cardiac arrest management. But an advanced life support, basically, you have your IV fluids, medications, stuff like that on those trucks.
All right, so this is about the meds, not necessarily the actual transportation vehicle itself. This is about the training of the paramedic, which, interesting enough for people in the county, knowing about it, some of the other counties that surround us and in North Carolina, this county has one of the highest trained staffs across the board as far as paramedic level, compared to some of the other counties that do use EMTBs and EMTIs. You guys are all paramedics, correct?
We've got a few basics on our part-time roster. I think I've got 2 basic EMTs and 1 intermediate now, and the rest of them are paramedic now. It makes it available because the state requires on certain procedures that we do, they want 2 paramedics on the scene in order for you to proceed. And that's a safety measure. That gives you a backup. If you get into trouble with the procedure, you got someone that can help you carry out that procedure.
So that's the state requirement, 2 paramedics on the scene? Okay,
Sure is.
all right, very good.
Thank you very much, gentlemen. We appreciate it.
Thank you, guys.
Item number 2 tonight is the minimum housing code update. Anthony Starr, Assistant Executive Director.
Okay, back again. Mr. French asked me to put together some information for you to consider. And so I've got a PowerPoint here that I'm going to walk through. And just to tell you, I think I'm going to show you some justifications, some reasons. We'll talk about reasons why not to do it, some challenges that you may have in implementing a minimum housing code. But ultimately, it is a policy decision for you as the board to make as to whether you have a county minimum housing code or not. And so I view my job here as, again, just to provide you with information that you can make an informed decision. Through my experience as having been a county planning director and been in local government for a number of years and have been a manager as well. And we went through this process a number of years ago when I was a planning director for Henderson County and implemented a minimum housing code. So a few things about this is, what is a minimum housing code? Just to kind of review a few things. It can protect a community from absentee property owners. It can establish certain minimum standards that you would have for decent human occupancy. It can prevent the decay or deterioration of places where people live. And I think that's where you're going to see an ongoing issue with the housing stock in our region. And just to illustrate this point, I pulled out some census data as I was putting this information together, and it's not in the PowerPoint, but the information isn't available for Alexander County, but it is for our region, and the census shows that just over 20% of the housing stock for our area was built prior to 1960. So it's over 50 years old now. And behind that, there's another 31% that was built prior to 1980. So along with that, consider the fact that since the year 2000, the number of housing units being constructed in our region has dropped by over 80%. Due to the recession, due to our economy in the region and everything. So what that will mean is that you have fewer new housing units coming online, but existing units getting older and older. And so what that will create is more conditions for deteriorating homes that aren't properly maintained, and all the consequences that come along with that, besides the folks living in that, whether they're renters or owner-occupied, or what have you, that will become an issue more and more as we go forward. I think not just for Alexander County, but our region and our state. And it's something that that is already, we're seeing it bubble up from some of our local governments as they're asking us to help address this issue as well. So just to mention to you, this particular draft code is based on the most common model that is used by local governments in North Carolina. It's originally created, the original form of it was created by the International Code Council, which writes our state building code. So what is unfit for human occupancy? It's where it's in disrepair, it's unsafe or unlawful, unsanitary conditions, filth or contamination, rat infested are examples. It may lack heating facilities or sanitary facilities like a toilet, and you'd be surprised what you run across sometimes. What is a code designed to do is to protect people that can't protect themselves. A lot of folks are renters. They don't have a choice or have much of a choice in terms of the housing that's available to them, what they can afford, or even owner-occupied housing sometimes too. So it's intended to make sure that they're safe and sanitary and fit for human occupancy. And that's not necessarily the same thing as good aesthetics. That's not really, good aesthetics are an issue, a legitimate concern, but that's not what a minimum housing code is primarily aimed at accomplishing. So it does make the owner of a structure responsible for its maintenance. You can see here, and I've got several pictures, many of which are from Alexander County and a few from Henderson County, where I need to fill in a few other examples that I'll show you. So you can see some of the conditions, unsanitary conditions, just sometimes it's just plain old junk that accumulates and it's not taken care of, or in this case on the right, it's a disconnected garbage disposal. It's leaking gray water into a pot beneath the sink. So overcrowding can be an issue, and that's one of the most difficult areas to address with the minimum housing code in terms of enforcement, and it can be one of the most politically charged, to be honest with you, in terms of addressing. And so the standard that's in there is pretty common, but it gets cited a lot in the reasons to adopt a minimum housing code, but frankly, it's not one of the areas where you end up doing a lot of enforcement with. One, because you don't usually get a lot of specific complaints. People might have anecdotal complaints, but they do come up from time to time. But they're also difficult to gauge and enforce. So, substandard living conditions, these were the picture on the right's from Alexander County. The picture on the left was a home in Henderson County that person was using that they just built themselves, didn't have a single building permit. You can see standing water in the HVAC vent on the right from a house in Alexander County. Mobile homes, you would be surprised with some of the conditions of homes that are unsafe and people are in. Sometimes it's just people being in them as squatters. They may not be official renters, but they're just there. They just moved into it because it kept the rain off their head for the most part. In other cases, they may not be occupied, but they're either an eyesore or they're unsafe for children or other people in the area. You know how it's difficult to control children sometimes, especially in a rural setting. That's where I grew up. We explored all over the place, And so if it's there and it's not put in a safe condition, it exposes them to that danger. So here's other elements, that homes can sit out and be, broken window syndrome has been known, as it's referred to, can be a source of crime. There's a correlation between crime that occurs and concentration of homes that are in substandard condition. So what does it cover? Well, this particular code, this draft code, only covers residential structures, which would include single, multifamily, site-built or stick-built homes, modular home, and manufactured homes. It would not include commercial or industrial buildings. What parts of the dwelling are covered under a minimum housing code typically, including this draft, is lighting, ventilation, heating, plumbing, fire and safety, mechanical, electrical, and maximum occupancy. Code requires that a house, there you go, have adequate plumbing facilities. You see this, you'd be surprised at what you see when you actually go into a home to do an inspection. The one on the right, they've just got sewage straight piped out onto the ground. The other one, they have disconnected plumbing utilities like a garbage disposal, or the sink underneath is leaking and rotted the floor out underneath it. Structurally sound, it would have to be structurally made sound to not only protect the occupants of the home, but those perhaps in some situations, folks that would be around it, as I talked about before, and children and the curious minds they have. You can see in that last slide where the structure's wet underneath and deteriorating and subject to collapse, as well as the home that I showed you before. And you can see a hole in the floor there next to an entryway as another example. I think all of those pictures from Alexander County. What next? Be free from fire hazards. we've made a lot of progress over the last few decades in reducing fire fatalities, and it's remarkable how fewer we have compared to what we did a few decades ago. But occasionally you do have folks that are engaging in unsafe practices, putting in a wood stove that maybe is not properly installed or have any sort of permits. Electrical hazards are surprisingly common. You can see here on the left, they had run cords from a neighboring unit to provide power to their house because their meter had been removed. And you can see here, the one in the upper right was an example from Henderson County where I think we had 4 or 5 homes all running their power off one breaker box on a pole. And so you see that, and it unfortunately results in fire and occasionally results in injury or death. And it's just the unfortunate judgment that people exercise or display sometimes. So maintaining indoor temperature is also a key thing. Sometimes, particularly with renters, the heating system will stop functioning and the owner is not responsive in getting it fixed. And so they're in there in the cold. Sometimes they're using heat sources that are not appropriate to try to keep warm, and that can result in fires or carbon monoxide poisoning. We ask that with a minimum housing code, it requires to be free from unsanitary conditions, and this is the responsibility of the owner in some cases. But if it's a tenant and a renter, it's their responsibility just as much as well. So there are provisions in there dealing with how you deal with rodent infestation or insect infestation, and usually if it's a single-family home, that's going to be the responsibility of the tenant, not the property owner. If it's a multifamily structure, it's going to be responsibility of the owner because simply a tenant cannot, if it's infested in one unit, they're not going to be able to treat the whole complex, and as a practical matter, they won't be able to address the infestation with just one unit. Another example of some of the things we've seen through the years with garbage is it just piles up. That used to be a hot tub, turned into a pseudo dumpster. One of the big things that we had in my experience is, that people get worried about, and it's legitimate concerns to ask about, is property rights and is the government overstepping its bounds, and that's a legitimate concern. I think that's about whether you adopt a minimum housing code. That's a policy decision, whether you view it's right for Alexander County or not. But as it relates specifically to how condemnation works, usually it seems worse than it is, or people fear what is relatively rare. Condemnation of homes where we say you cannot reside in this dwelling any longer are rare. And I'm with the exception of when a house fire occurs or something like that, and people want to go back in, that just doesn't happen very often. But occasionally it will. So, but some of the comments I had when we went through this a few years ago in Henderson County was, were people going to be removed in their homes overnight? No, they're not going to be removed in their homes overnight unless it's like one of those emergency situations like a fire. And even in those situations, the Red Cross is there to provide them emergency shelter and housing, as well as other community organizations. One individual can't condemn a dwelling. There's an appeal process there that's involved that affords them due process. Your Board of Adjustment could serve as that appeal body. Planning Board and Board of Adjustment, that's the way we set it up. You could choose to set up a special board just for minimum housing code, but probably with the volume of calls, volume of appeals you would have, probably not practical to do so, especially when the Board of Adjustment's familiar with how to conduct itself in a hearing and appeal setting. They're a little bit more efficient at it, and we just had very few cases of appeals in my experience where we've had minimum housing code. Here's a couple of examples of homes that would Henderson County that stayed empty and stayed open and were not made safe from resulting of a fire here. This one was a fatality. It stayed in place before we had minimum housing code. It stayed in place for like 2 years in that condition. Of course, you can imagine the conditions with children sometimes exploring and everything too sometimes. Another example of housing here. So go ahead and go to the next slide there, Chad. So how would it be administered? You know, there's particular provisions I'll be glad to answer questions about with this draft code. It is the most common version, but I would suggest to you that probably as important, if not more important than what the actual code says, is the manner in which it's administered. Because if you could have a situation where it's maybe too lenient in your view, and then it's not deemed effective for the resources you put into it, or you might get the wrong person in there that's overbearing and causes a lot of problems in that way. So I think making sure that you have a good person doing that with a proper oversight is key as much as it is to the actual ordinance language itself. Probably, I would say it's more important, to be frank with you. So the way this one, we set it up here in this particular thing, it can be complaint-driven. That's probably the way the most of the time it works, unless there just happens to be particular cases along main thoroughfares that staff becomes aware of, or you as commissioners become aware of and want to relay to the appropriate staff to administer the program. Planning department would administer the program. You could probably address, with the number of houses you have in your county, you could probably address this need if you implemented this with 1 working day per week, a person working on 1 day per week. As I understand, though, is that you have conversations with Mr. French and your other staff, Building Inspections Office, Seth, and others, you know, you're pretty limited on your resources, what you have now. They appear to be working pretty hard and trying to maintain their current duties. So I think you might have a problem, it sounds like, with just adding these duties on to your existing staff. So what are your options? You can hire another person to do this part-time, and that's certainly a viable option. You can contract it out as well. I threw up the numbers there. I'm not trying to sell you on that. If you do it, that's fine. If you don't do it, that's fine too. Just wanted you, I anticipated you would ask the question, what's it going to cost? And so I wanted to go ahead and give you an example of what it would cost here, because that was one of the first things that my board said when I was in Henderson County was, what's this going to cost? And it's always an issue, and a very appropriate question to always ask. So there's a lot of things that go in with administration, of course, besides receiving the complaints and doing the inspections. There's setting up information for folks, taking those calls. A lot of times you'll get calls and they're not legitimate. And a good percentage of those will be just, you know, calls that are frivolous. You know, you already see this probably with some code enforcement in other areas, is that neighbor disputes happen, and sometimes they try to use county ordinances as weapons, you know, in their disputes. And that happens sometimes, and it just takes us going through the process of inspecting it and realizing that it's not a legitimate concern, or it is. And we usually, the way we handle it is we don't try to worry about the motivation for the person making the complaint. We just deal with, is it a violation or not, and does it need to be corrected or not? And that's all we can control and all you can control as a local government. So there's a lot of details, training. There's certifications that can be obtained for minimum housing code inspectors. There's an association for that in North Carolina. And so we do this. I would say, though, that probably 80% of the codes that are administered in the state by local governments are not done by a certified person in minimum housing code, but it's always a good idea. It makes it more defensible. You have a more knowledgeable person in place. So we'd be able to provide that to you if you wanted it. If not, you certainly have other options about how you staff this if you choose to proceed with it. So, how violations would be handled if you had it: you get the complaint, there's an inspection made, and at that point either no violation is found or there is a violation, and if so, then you issue a notice of violation and give them detailed instructions about how they need to remedy the situation. Sometimes, most of the time, it's very simple stuff. Get the heating system running again, get an HVAC contractor out there to put it back in working order. Sometimes it might be more involved. The amount of time that's given to them is not specified in the ordinance because there are too many variables and too many situations involved to be able to say we're going to give everybody 2 weeks, or we're going to give everybody 60 days, or we're going to give everybody 90 days. How that's handled is you look at the severity of the repairs that are needed and the expense of the repairs that are needed, and use that to kind of make a reasonable time, give them a reasonable time frame to accomplish that. and get it put back the way that it needs to be. So if there's a violation, then they fix the violation, or if they disagree, they have the ability to make an appeal. That goes to, first, it's heard by a staff person to kind of screen those out, sometimes as an extra layer of accountability for the code enforcement officer. And either that appeal is granted at that point at the staff level relatively quickly if that occurs, or if they don't get the resolution to their satisfaction at that point, they can appeal. It goes on to the Board of Adjustment. And the Board of Adjustment schedules a hearing, has its hearing, renders its decision. They'll usually have the hearing 1 month, and then they'll get a preliminary indication of what they're going to do that month at that same meeting and issue a written order. The following meeting is usually where it works out. So when there is an appeal, the enforcement action is put on hold, so they're not fined or any further action taken against them until their appeal process is remedied. So any questions you may have, I'd be glad to answer at this point. If you choose to go, if you deem it's appropriate for Alexander County to have a minimum housing code, I think what you have there is a solid starting point. You may get into it in a couple of years and determine if there's tweaks that you need to make to your ordinance to address whatever local needs you have. I took the liberty of creating some key points here for you. It's just a one-pager front and back to just common questions that would come up. You could use something like this in educating the public. And if you were to adopt it, my recommendation would be to, after you determine you do want to adopt it, is make the effective date a few months out from when you adopt it, to give notice to the public and give them time to, if they think they have any violations on their own, they can go ahead and make those corrections, and allow time for staff to get all the procedures and forms and everything set up and get ready to administer it in the most effective and efficient way. So be glad to answer any questions you have.
Well, I have one question, because I'm always about, what can you do to help the people so that they can alleviate these problems? And in doing this and the enforcement part of it, and in dealing with the folks that may have a problem, would you also educate them where they could turn to get the grants or the money that they need in order to be able to take care of this situation? Because I know that those grants are out there, and they come through the COG, administered through the county, and those type of things, which would give us a better way of letting these people know about those programs, because trying to educate the citizens of Alexander County is difficult because of our limited availability of providing the information to them, because we only have 2 newspapers and 1 radio station.
Sure.
So it's hard to get that information to them. And that's why I say it's hard to educate them. It's just because I'm not able to get the information to them.
Sure.
Not like it is in other areas. So, when you go out to do these things and do these inspections, does that enforcement officer, would he make sure, or is it in there that you could make sure that these are available to the citizens, so that, not only are you trying to enforce, but you're also trying to educate, assist, and help that individual?
Certainly, that is the way that I would have it done if the person worked for me. And anyone that's ever worked for me, our approach has always been, you're not there to beat people over the head with this stuff. You're there to be helpful. You've got an obligation you got to meet with certain code requirements, and you need to coach them along about how to get it best addressed. Some cases, they're not going to have the means, if it's an owner-occupied home, to address the issue. And that may be through the urgent repair program that we have, where we fix people's windows or holes in a roof or their HVAC system that we have. Now, those funds aren't as plentiful as they used to be, but we still have those programs. And Nancy Coley, which some of you are familiar with, she administers that program for us at the council of governments. And certainly, if we were doing the inspections, we'd make sure there was a seamless kind of transition there, and that information was to whoever needed it, if it were particularly an owner-occupied. But I'll be honest with you, the owner-occupied stuff is going to be less the issue and more probably the renter. I mean, the only time you usually see the owner-occupied situation come up where you've got a violation of minimum housing code for an owner-occupied home is when it's become an issue visually outside the home. You know, maybe a neighbor doesn't like the condition that the house has fell into. I'll tell you, in Henderson County, one of the biggest, and it was surprising to me, supporters we had for the minimum housing code was the realtor community, because they were complaining that I've got this house on the market, I need to try to sell it, and I can't sell it because this house beside it is in such bad condition, you know, and it's a legitimate concern. You know, it did affect their neighbor in that way. It's more than just the person living in the home sometimes. But a lot of times, if it's an internal thing in the house, no one's going to know really if it's there unless you have some sort of visitor that comes there and sees a child living in a dangerous condition, and then they report it to DSS and they have their mechanisms to try to help enforce that too, and you get a complaint that way. But that's usually, if you get complaints, it's going to be for interior things that are not obvious from the outside of the home. It's going to usually 9 times out of 10 come from a tenant that's not happy with the situation.
What type of response when you did this in Henderson County? Did the citizens, how did they react at first?
There was a few folks that were concerned about it. You know, I think what we did there is there was a landlord association there that we had conversations with and tried to address their concerns ahead of time, and they really didn't have any major objections at that point. Once we got to the point where we adopted this code as it is today, what it started out with was much different than what it is here today in Henderson County. And we basically took, you know, yeah, there's this model code that the International Code Council puts out there, but really, frankly, it goes much further than I think most counties want to go in North Carolina. And so we pared it down quite a bit and just kept it to the basics. And that's what I used as the starting point for you, is just keeping it at the basics from what was actually adopted in Henderson County, which was a pretty conservative county there as well. And there was some concern about it, but not an outpouring. And then after we adopted it, it really wasn't much of an issue. Some of the fears turned out to be worse than what the reality turned out to be in our case there.
Okay, thank you. Does any other commissioner have any questions?
You just asked mine.
Okay. Well, I mean, it's all about helping people. I mean, you know, I think that the things that, it was like whenever the folks were having a hard time with their home loans and they were being foreclosed on, we had a difficult time of getting that information out as to what COG was offering, how they were there available to help them, and the folks were maybe going into foreclosure prior, and they didn't know that that help was there, and it's extremely frustrating, not able to do the things that you need to do to help the folks that need help.
Yeah.
You know, so that's where I was
No,
at.
my question was, how did Henderson County go for this?
okay.
That was,
I'm sorry, how did they what?
he asked the
Oh,
question.
he already
I
asked,
just
okay.
missed the question.
Gotcha.
I've got a couple questions. You know, it's not just for the inhabitants of the home, but it also can be for the public safety. So does failing septic systems causing contamination, you know, to your neighbor's property, is that addressed in here? Could it be addressed in here?
Not specifically, but it does address it in there indirectly. But I'll point out that there's already an enforcement mechanism for that particular case with your county health department.
Okay. And I'm thinking of another example with the recession that we've went through and the downturn in housing. There were unfinished homes sitting all over the country. Big problem in every state. But I'm thinking of an example right now where a house has been sitting for a long time unfinished. It may still be structurally sound. I am very doubtful about that, but say it were. But I do know that it is causing a lot of problems as far as mosquito infestations, because the drainage was not properly done around the house, and it was actually not completed. So is that something that we could, I know that's kind of addressed here indirectly, but.
It's one of the trickier areas to address, and there's no magic pill in terms of how do you write the ordinance language to make that effective. It just takes close coordination with your county attorney to navigate through that. Some of the things that we used was, does it have an active building permit? How long has it been since they've had the permit? Is it still active? How long has it been since they did any work? What are the conditions that are a problem? Is it just an aesthetic thing, or is it a thing where it's unsafe? They've got rebar that's exposed, for people to fall onto, or it's not safe because it wasn't ever made, framing wasn't ever completed or something. There's some calculations about dilapidated housing in the code, and basically you run through whether you say it needs to be repaired or it needs to be torn down, and to make that calculation, the code defines what's dilapidated, and it basically is you make an estimate about how much it would cost to repair the structure. And if it's more than half of the value of the home, then you can order that it be demolished. What usually, just as a practical matter, you start with is the tax value. And then what we always did is if the property owner didn't want it to be demolished, they could always provide additional information to make that calculation if they wanted to go through the expense. Maybe they had done an appraisal or something recently. We certainly would always use that information over the tax value because it's more detailed for that particular site. But buildings under construction is a difficult one to address, and I can't say definitively to you that you get every one of those addressed with this code. It's a case-by-case situation.
Well, it seems to be abandoned, so. that's why
And then if it is, then what you can do is you can go in there and say, probably if it probably is in disrepair to the state, that it would cost more to repair it than it would to tear it down, than what it's valued at. And then you could hire a contractor to tear it down, place that cost of that work as a lien on the property, gets placed as a tax lien on the property. And if they don't pay that within a certain amount of time frame, just like any other tax lien, it can go to tax foreclosure, and then you get the county's funds back by selling the property. But that's rare.
Right.
But it is there as a legal remedy.
Yeah, thank you.
Anybody else have any questions? Any statements? Okay.
Mr. Stark, what is, you have the Article 8 and reference standards here of all the North Carolina building codes, plumbing codes, mechanical codes, fire codes. What does this do that they don't?
Okay, so what those codes deal with most of the time is they're only dealing with the construction period. So after construction's complete, the jurisdiction really ends. And so the building inspector is not going to be able to use the building code to go in there and make them remedy things. Now, occasionally they can in commercial and multifamily structures that are life safety issues. But that's a small percentage of compared to what the kinds of issues that are addressed with minimum housing code. Plus the fact that you have building codes that change over time, and they would have to go through the trouble of trying to figure out which building code it was built under at the time. Because particularly, most of your housing stock was built at a time which a building code was not in place, because it was, most counties in North Carolina did not have electrical and building codes in place till the mid-'70s or early '80s. So if it was built prior to that, there isn't even a code that would have applied to begin with. Good question, though.
Anything further? Mr. Starr, thank you very much. I think that enlightened us to the minimum housing and what we were looking at and what we were thinking about, so thank you very much. I appreciate the COG and what they've done tonight. Good information, good job.
Well, we're glad to serve you. We're excited to be able to provide whatever your needs are and whatever direction you are. We're here to, you guys make the policy decisions. We're just here to provide you the information and help you get where you want to go strategically. So thank you for allowing us to come do this.
Thank you very much, sir. Item number 3 on the agenda is other business. I'll call on Mr. Rick French, County Manager.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. On Monday, the April 14th, we had a county staff meeting. We asked, bless you, we asked for all capital items remaining in the current 2013-2014 budget. We're placing all those items on hold. In addition, any full or part-time vacancies that occur must be reviewed by the county manager on a case-by-case basis before they are advertised and filled. We are working hard towards trying to have more budget savings during the next 2 months, which are the last 2 months of this fiscal year. Therefore, budget amendments will be at a minimum as they come to you. And I'd also like to just remind the board that our next meeting is May the 5th, and if the if Larry, if you and the Finance Committee would stay a couple of minutes, I'd like to set a date for us for our next meeting.
Okay.
For the Finance Committee,
All
please.
right, sounds good.
Thank you.
Anyone else have anything? I'd like to again remind the folks in the Stony Point area that the power outages, because of a substation there in the Stony Point area, and they're experiencing these outages, Duke Power is on the scene, and they are doing everything they can to get the power back up and going. So with that, ladies and gentlemen, I accept a motion to adjourn.
Make a motion to adjourn this session.
Second.
Motion's made and seconded. Is there any discussion? There being none, all those in favor indicate by raising your right hand. Those opposed likewise, motion carries.